Welcome to Perspectives, everyone. Today, I'm filling in for Kurt Bjorklund. My name is Jonathan Thiede, and I am on the staff here at Orchard Hill Church. And I'm joined by two wonderful gentlemen from Geneva College. We have Doug Bradbury and Terry Thomas, and they are both professors of biblical studies at Geneva College. And boy, we're going to need it because we're tackling a pretty heavy topic today. We're talking about civil disobedience, and that's a phrase that I think people throw around, but I think it's helpful for us just to understand what we're talking about. So why don't we start there? You know, what is civil disobedience, and maybe what are some potential examples that people come up with?
Well, I'll tell you one. A little story about, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. I was speaking at this church, and a guy said, "Hey, listen, I want to ask you about civil disobedience." And he was a real kind of, hippie-looking kind of guy. I thought to myself, "Oh, okay, he's on the edge here." So I said, "So what do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I know you said you went to high school and college in the '60s. And that was a time of agonizing reappraisal." And I was like, "Yeah, that was really something." He goes, "A lot of protests." And so he goes, "Well, I was in high school then too. And we developed a protest at our high school, and he said, and we really wanted to make it massive. So what we did was, one night we broke into the high school, and we went into their own mimeograph machines and made our handouts for the walkout that was going to be the next day. And we figured we're sticking it to the man, using his own stuff to make the." And I said, "Wow!" And I said to him, "What was the protest about?" He goes, "Well, we wanted chocolate milk in the cafeteria." Okay. So yeah, you're right. There's been a lot of contention that allows people to be civilly disobedient, but we present today as well.
Yeah. Well, I think when you think about civil disobedience, things come to your mind. And one is you have pictures of people protesting, throwing things at police, and using all sorts of epithets that are disparaging and so forth. And then you have the other spaces, if you think of the history of like the civil rights and so forth, which was oriented towards civil disobedience, but truly being civil in their disobedience, And it wasn't just civil though, because civil sounds so milquetoast. Yeah, it's what King used to call soul force. This idea of how do you actually love your enemy, and you love your enemy in a way that it confronts the structures that your enemy is following. And so what that did is it was about restoring dignity to both the person who was protesting, but also to the person who they were protesting against. And then what that did is allowed attention then to be brought towards the actual structure there. So there's two thoughts. One is that you have civil disobedience, which is we're going to be disobedient to some civil law, some civil thing that's out there. And the other is it's the how we do it. It's civil disobedience is, can you do it with civility? In Christians, we have that in and of itself. We have I think a history by which how do we go about doing that, And there's a wonderful book by Richard Mouw called Uncommon Decency, right? And Richard Mouw was like the president of Fuller Seminary for lots of years, and this sort of thing. And this came out, and he was saying like, how do we have convictions? A lot of times people have strong convictions but don't act very civil. Or the other side is people are very civil but don't have strong convictions. And so they'll like anything goes. And so what he's saying is, how do you bridge the two? How do you have something where it's both civil and actually strong convictions at the same time? And I think that's where, for many Christians, that's kind of where we're at today. Like how do you say, hey, I really hold strongly to this idea, but how do I express those things? And quite honestly, particularly as we step into this election season, so forth like that, not a lot has to be said in terms of there's not a lot of civility that's happening culturally. And so this is a great invitation, I think, for us to think about that.
Yeah, as I was looking at a couple of passages in the Bible about this, I found this one in the Proverbs 18, where it says, "Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." And that seems like the context in there says of civil disobedience in our culture now. It's that, people love to talk. They love to yell. They love to do something radical. But they haven't thought a whole lot always about their opinion, and basically they're only interested in their own opinion. They're not interested in any kind of a dialogue, with other people at that point. We talked a little bit about how there is certainly a number of very famous passages in the Bible about civil disobedience. You start. You get one.
Well, First Peter, right? Is that the one you're thinking of?
That's a good one.
Let's pull it up there.
Yeah, this is 1 Peter 3, verse. That's Romans, so probably won't find it there. This chapter.
Sword.
Yeah, right. It says, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." I think that's part of it, is that you should always be prepared to talk about your convictions and be willing to stand up for your convictions. But you do it, the words there are with gentleness and kindness. That's not what we hear a lot of in the argument about how I'm going to go about being civil. It's not that it's a question of whether the contents, the issue, the truth or the lack of truth, whatever, isn't willing or legitimate to be discussed. It's about how you do it, I think, at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just following up on that, I mean, how can we as Christians go about knowing, I guess for lack of a better phrase, like the severity of the issue? You bring up the chocolate milk at the beginning. It's an injustice, to be sure. But how do we? How can we assess biblically, like when something is truly an injustice versus when it's a preference that I can sort of serve someone by just saying, okay, well, this kid in the cafeteria is allergic to chocolate milk, so therefore we're not going to have it. These issues kind of get messy.
Okay, well, how did Moses' mom know?
Well, this is the thing that, as we talk about civil disobedience, we could look at verses and kind of extrapolate. This is what this verse is talking about here. But particularly as we think back in the last 50 years or so, probably one of the most significant shifts in American society had to do with the civil rights movement. And that was an active civil disobedience. And that sort of getting back into that, there's a consciousness that sort of informed those actions. So for instance, Martin Luther King Jr., he came out of that sort of black theology, slaveholder theology, and what a number of theologians and also scholars would say is that when you look at black theology or King, that was influenced by a narrative versus most white theology, Reformed theology, those sorts of things come out of Pauline consciousnness. So the writings of Paul is more of a cognitive thinking about thing, whereas the black theology came out of a story, and what enveloped them was this story of slaves being set free. And so even as we look historically, people refer to, and even during the time, that Martin Luther King was viewed as the second Moses, right? Well, if you think about that, he comes out of this rich tradition where there have been people, biblical characters, who practice civil disobedience. We mentioned Moses' mother, right, who decided, I'm not going to kill my son.
The Pharaoh told him, to kill all these male babies because he had heard the threat that they might pose to and they were like, no. We're gonna hide them. And God blessed that.
Right. And then you have Daniel, who, interesting, when you go to that story, we read that Daniel goes and he prays in front of an open window. Right? So there's an intention, you get the sense there's an intentionality that he's not trying to hide his commitments to what he's convicted about. He's like, I'm going to do this, and he does it so that
and he realizes that it's in opposition to the law of the land. At that point, he does it on purpose.
He'll be killed,
and he'll pay the price for it. And that's part of what it is too. That's why it's difficult to do this in a proper way, because you have to not only consider the issue of the truth that you're trying to speak for, but what the consequences of it might be as well.
Right. The second thing that I think is interesting with that is that when you look at historically in the civil rights in particular, you had characters like Bayard Rustin and Claude Colvin and so forth, who was just a 15-year-old on the bus. She was actually before Rosa Parks. And what she said is she never thought what she was doing by sitting in the front was wrong. What she thought was it was right based upon I have a constitutional right to be here. And so that sometimes it's not how am I disobedient, it's how am I obedient to this larger truth. And I think that's the thing that should be driving, if we're talking about, hey, standing up to some injustice, it's because you have a sense of justice, which is larger. And in the context of the civil rights, they always referred to, that's why you had these court cases all the time, that they have constitutional rights to be able to do these sorts of things. I have a right to be able to be here. I have a right to be able to go to these schools and so forth like that. And so it was not so much of the emphasis on how do I become disobedient, it's how am I obedient to this larger truth. And I think that's a different thing altogether. And so as Christians, I think what we want to look at is, hey, is there something larger than this sort of cultural apparatus that I'm committed to being loyal to, being faithful to?
Yeah, and the same thing, we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these are guys that got told they had to pray to the emperor, and they were like, no, that's not our thing. We can't obey God. We can't live lives pleasing and faithful to God. By doing that, we're going to do the opposite, even if it means that we die, And sure enough, they're going to die. They get sent down to the fiery furnace. One of the all-time great ones was, they're going down there. And a lot of people think, well, they must have had such great confidence that God was going to save them down there when they got down, that they were able to be so bold. Well, and not so much, because on the way down, they say, we're never going to do this. Even if you throw us in the fire, God will take care of us. Then they say, even if he doesn't take care of us now, So you get that sense of they were committed. They were committed to doing the truth of it, what the right thing was. And they knew what the consequences might be, but the truth was overwhelming, at that point. And they weren't going to give over into that. I think there's numerous examples of that. I think what creates the dilemma for Christians is this idea that somehow it's illegitimate to take a position contrary to what's going on. Now, here's an interesting story, just about because this is part of the dilemma. Paul has been arrested. He's put in prison. He's going to be tried for being a missionary for Jesus. And he won't shut up, and they keep telling him, "Shut up! We don't want to hear this." Same thing with Peter and John in Acts. They're put in prison and told, "Hey, quit talking about this guy." And all the officials, both Jewish and non-Jewish, they see the dilemma of this overwhelming new perspective of truth on culture, and they don't want it. And they tell them to stop, and they're like, "Hey, who are we going to listen to, God or you?" We're listening to whatever that means. We're gonna go for it. Well, interestingly enough, when Paul is in prison, is at the time of Nero, okay? And Nero was, I don't think anybody makes an argument that he was a great moral leader of his country or whatever,
Known as the puppy emperor.
But there was right around that time, there was a giant fire in Rome, and many people, including officials and historians, think that Nero might have set the fire. It was his thing. Of course, he couldn't take the blame for it. So what he did was he looked around and said, "Well, who do people, hate? Who do they think that we don't want that kind of thing? Christians. Let's blame it on them." And so that through especially the Jewish Christians made them leave. All had to leave Rome, and the others were forbidden for doing this. Meanwhile, Paul he's in prison. What's he doing? He's saying, well, I'm talking to everybody I see, including the guards, the imperial guards of I think sharing the gospel with them, telling them the truth of this. But then, this is where the dilemma happens. He writes this. This is in Romans, the book to Romans 13. He says, everybody must submit himself to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except that which God has established, and the authorities that exist have been established by God. Oh, there's your problem.
Yeah.
So in other words, he wants to affirm that God's in control of reality, and he has established these governments, even Nero, even the Roman government, in spite of the fact that it's clearly anti-Christian at that point, and he is standing against it in some ways, as some of the other disciples. So the authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear and from the one in authority? Then do what's right, and they will commend you. For he is God's servant, and for you to do what is good. And if you do what's wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant as an agent of wrath and bringing punishment to the wrongdoer. Therefore, if necessary, to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of the conscience. This is also why you should pay your taxes, oh boy. And for the government authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone everyone what you owe him. And if you owe taxes, pay the taxes. If revenue, then pay the revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. So it seems hard to believe that you have the same guys who affirm the importance of the truth and the willingness to be in contradiction with that, if not with the truth, but with somebody trying to oppress it or withhold it, and willing to pay the price for it, and then turn around and say that those very same people are for the good. Now, here's the thing, though. I don't think that gives universal affirmation to anybody who's a leader of some kind. Basically says, well, God put me in this position. I guess whatever I do must be right.
Right.
I think it's an interesting thought, though, because I think from a non-Christian perspective, it's easy to read that passage and it almost seems as if it's a rebuke to the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's of the world. But the fact that, as we've discussed, there's civil disobedience all throughout, primarily in the Old Testament, I think that hints to the fact that there are opportunities where civil disobedience is blessed by God and something that we should.
So you got to ask yourself some questions then. When you're confronted with that contradiction of, it's simple in one way. God says this, somebody says do the opposite. Who do you listen to?
Sure.
That's the simple piece, in a way. If you see God command you to do this, to be good, to be honoring, to be respectful, to be submissive, and somebody suggests, no, don't do that, we do the opposite. You know who you got to listen to, okay? Now you do it you have a rationale for it. You explain why that's the case. You can dialogue with people. You can have that conversation. You do it with dignity and respect, like it says in 1 Peter there. But at some point, you are faced with the question of, am I going to take a stance and an action that is opposed to this in some way? So what do you think the things are that you should ask? What kind of questions do you think you should ask yourself if you're going to move in that direction?
Well, I think the first thing is all this is predicated on some idea of what justice is. So, it's interesting because there's stuff even in terms of the dynamic going on with Israel and Palestine right now. There's a theology of the land. Well, here's the theology of the land. If you look at Leviticus and so forth, God says, hey, you do these things, why? Because it's mine, right? And so the big picture, like 30,000-foot aerial picture, is simply this: everything belongs to the Lord. And so because of that, he's able to say, hey, whenever you glean the fields, don't go to the edges. Why? Because the sojourners, that's the way I feed them. That's the way I take care of the animals and so forth. So there's this larger sense of God's justice, which is about God's relationship to everything. And so I think that's the first and foremost thing is how does God define justice in this thing, being that he is sovereign, that he's the Lord, that he owns all things, and therefore he has a right to be able to.
Yeah, and the law at that point isn't a subjective thing.
Right.
The law isn't a matter of just this is what I say it is.
Right.
This is how I make it up. This is how I want it to be. We live in a world where we believe that God is in control of things, and He's organized it. And here's the deal: He's organized it for our good and experience. For the most positive experience you can have. And so, as a result of trying to discover that truth, trying to discover that law, trying to live by that law becomes important. And the claim that it's just a matter of you have to do this because I tell you to do it. And there's no argument to try to show that there is something good about this. At that point, that I think is one of the questions you have to ask yourself. Is there something good?
Yeah, but I think the second, though, is wedded to it. And what we typically do is we'll break things into parts. So you got to have justice, you got to have this and so forth. You can't have justice without love. And so this is the piece there, and this was the thing that King was so committed to. He says, you can't pursue an issue around justice if there's no loving dynamic to that, because it's that love piece which corrects, if you will, the dignity of the other. It helps the person see who they truly are as image bearer of God and so forth. And that gives you the right stance then to look at, hey, what sort of structure has been created which is diminishing that person, that I-thou, as Martin Buber says, I-thou relationship. And I think that's another, the dynamic there is it's not just how do I identify justice and then I'm going to get in the face of the man. It's how do I love, think about it, that's wild. Jesus says you're going to love your enemy. He doesn't even say your enemy is going to change.
Yeah.
You love him. And we know this because God, what we read is God, while we are yet sinners, Paul says, while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us, right? So it wasn't that we stopped sinning. It was sort of, we have this model, and what we think happens in the context of the narrative of the cross, you see, is that the cross then becomes an act of civil disobedience in the sense that Christ submits himself to a point of even death in order to forsake of love. So that becomes the ultimate sacrifice for this justice. That's the injustice of our separation from God, the injustice of what's going on because of our sin and so forth like that. Christ's sacrifice covers that injustice,
Yeah, John Calvin in his classic Institutes of the Christian Religion, in Book 4, Chapter 20, I never knew that.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, that one, yeah. He tries to make an argument for what, how can you make a rational decision to determine that you're doing the right thing if you're moving in opposition to somebody like that, and particularly like in what we call just war or in civil disobedience. He says one of the first questions you got to ask is this purely motivated by selfishness on my part?
Right.
In other words, is the brokenness of the world, is the sinfulness of the world, and do I only care about this because I'm
going to benefit.
I'm personally going to benefit from this. So is it just for me? Is it just about? It's not about the common good. Yeah. It's not about some sort of lawfulness built into the creation itself. It's not about what does justice look. How do we define justice? How does it look like? He says you should directly ask the question: am I doing this for some selfish reason? And I had to search myself to see whether that's the case. Then the other thing he says, when you find yourself in opposition, you've drawn the lines, and they're on that side, and I'm on this side now. He says, can you still see them as people made in the image of God on the other side of the street? And that is, when we talk about the people who have convictions but aren't real civil, that's part of the dilemma. They treat as if they're not a person.
Right.
They treat the person as if they're not made in the image of God, that they don't have worth, that you don't care about their good.
Right.
You only care about your good in some way, or your truthfulness, or or winning, or something like that. And he says that's a big deal. That's a question you got to ask. And I suspect that there's a lot of protests that people get involved with, especially ones that become aggravated and maybe even violent, where they don't see the people like that. They don't see the person on the other side being man. Because how could you if you were violent towards them? How could you if you said, well, I'm going to kill you? You want to kill me? I'm going to kill you. You know, you wouldn't act that way.
Yeah, and then, you know, the idea is if you are going into this just war, does the end justify killing image bearers of God?
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? And so if you do so, is there a weight? Do you go in with tears in your eyes because you realize what you're doing is so profane? This is what Bonhoeffer really struggled with, by the way. You know, when he was, you know, the German church for the most part was very silent with regard, well, some of the church, you know, very silent during World War II, you know, in terms of the way the Nazis were handling the Jews. And it wasn't until, and Bonhoeffer came to the U.S.
Their argument was an attempt at Romans 13 sometimes, simply saying, well, I'm just doing what I'm told.
Right.
This God put it in place.
Up, right.
I just obey him.
Right.
You know.
And that's an interesting point because...
By the way, that defense didn't work at the Nuremberg trials.
No.
Namely that I was just following orders.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, so I think for him, but he came to that place and he writes about it in terms of even where he was part of this plot to kill Hitler, assassinate Hitler, was that even if it was sort of like this damning of his own soul, which you think about that, it was still out of this place of love, like it'd be the lives that would be saved. So it was just still motivated out of this space of, I'd be willing to take the hit, if you will, so that other people would have the opportunity to live, you know, and this sort of thing. And it wasn't this sort of like the demonization of, I see them across the way and let's go get those guys. But instead it's this spirit of how do you love the person that you're opposing right now and recognize that what they're opposing. You know, John Lewis, the senator who passed away a couple years ago, he talked about when they would do training for civil disobedience, what they had to do is they would go to the Highlander Folk School, you know, up in Tennessee, and they'd be practicing these scenarios. And then what they would do is they say when there's a guy who's a white supremacist and he's kicking you in the head and spitting on you and those sorts of things, they would do sort of like these mindful exercises, get this, where they'd say, imagine that person as a little baby. Like try to see that person and then ask yourself, what had to happen in their life for them to be filled with such hatred towards me, towards you? So the idea is like, how do you have to do some real training, you know, mind discipline and yourself to say, how do I, if I'm going to engage in this civil disobedience, how do I do so in a way that benefits I see them and I allow them, I become the subject of violence because Jesus became the object of violence. You know, I take it a hit because Jesus took the hit. I mean, this was very much part of the consciousness of the civil disobedience here during the civil rights, you know. And I think that also took on the fact that how do I see them as they're not being who God's created them to be, right? And you could call it, you know, they're inflamed with sin and so forth, but at the end of the day, it's like they're still image bearers of God who are not living out that call to be rulers, you know, of God's goodness and truth and so forth. So how do I see them through a different lens and realize what had to happen in their life to be filled with so much hate?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the concept of being an image bearer is really important. You mentioned the election coming up. I mean, I think if we could all just keep that in mind, it's so easy to, in our minds, to make it an us versus them scenario. But the sovereignty of God helps us, I think, piece that together to know I can fight for good and fight from a place of rest, knowing that He's also sort of fighting as well. Whereas I think you get more of the nasty sort of violence when you do have, you can understand if someone has the mentality, you know, if I don't win today, you know, evil wins. But we, I think, have this, we've seen it throughout history all the time where evil seems to win the day and yet God is actually doing something. I think having that trust is really important. So.
Yeah, and it's easy to be self-righteous, and it's easy to convince yourself that you're doing something that God is really happy with. And so, and it's like oftentimes you see people who are yelling Bible verses at people, and you look at their face, you think to yourself, "Wow, you're having a great time, aren't you?" I mean, and there's such anger in it. You think this isn't giving an account of what it is you believe, where your hope is, with gentleness and kindness.
Yeah, if the joy of the Lord is your strength, please inform your face.
That's true. That's true.
But I think even that is, it's not your joy for the Lord, it's God's joy for you, which gets back to this, it's this I-thou dynamic. My son he's heading off to college, and he's going to one of these schools where he has to pick pronouns and all this sort of thing.
Sure.
And so what we're saying is like, hey, your pronoun should be thee and thou, because you're an image bearer of God. You belong to Him. We are actually in Christ. And so do we see not just ourselves as image bearers of that, and that's a thou, right? This is where Martin Buber says, he can never have an I, thou, he has I-thou. He's saying because it can never be a separate thou and a separate I. It's always connected. So we're always in relationship. We're always in relationship with this other image bearer. And therefore, there's no separate like I. It's always in connection to the people around you. And when you have that as part of your consciousness, then any harm that I do to you is I'm doing harm to because we're connected. And this is the whole point. Like if I'm mistreating you, then I'm actually mistreating myself. And so the oppression piece comes in that you're actually trying to unleash, you're trying to unchain that other person from being who God has called them to be as an image bearer of Him. And I think that takes some work. And what I see a lot in civil disobedience in the United States here, I don't see that sort of mindfulness stuff happening. I see instead like people saying your mother never loved you. Like there's all this hatred stuff that's being spewed out instead of sort of like how do you live with these? You go before the others, recognize the holiness of who they are, and you're trying to remind them, brother, sister, what you're doing. This is not who God called you to be, right? And so, and what King and the folks civil rights, they said, the only way to get there is through love. The only way to do that is by having a loving disposition in the midst of taking on the harm yourself. And it should be noted that King, he borrowed the technique. The theology of it was from Jesus in terms of Jesus' own life, loving your enemies, submitting to one another, and himself submitting to the cross. But the technique of it, he borrowed from Gandhi. So Gandhi put that really into a place of saying, okay, here's how we go about doing mass disruption. We're not going to ride buses. We're not going to purchase these things, those sorts of things. But as the theology was what Gandhi understood that through Jesus, and then he put it into practice in those ways. So there was a track record where you saw that being lived out. And it was never about conquering your enemy, but it was about restoring their dignity, them becoming who God had called them to be.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so if we could maybe land the plane, just a couple different principles that
you go first.
Give people. The first thing that comes to my mind is, maybe this just says more how I'm wired, is what you were saying earlier about asking the question, is this a genuine injustice, a genuine evil that God is calling me to fight, or are my toes just being stepped on a little bit? Is there something about the way I am shaping my identity? Am I putting too much stock in something that is outside of Christ? Am I putting too much stock in the fact that I'm an American, or I'm a Pennsylvanian, or I'm whatever? I'm a Packers fan, and so.
Well, and sometimes people don't even ask that question if the issue isn't stepping on their toes. So in other words, they're just fine with injustice going on or whatever, because it doesn't affect me. What do I care? But if it affects me, well, then I'm concerned about it.
Right.
That's why I would say one of the other things that's important. This is about doing stuff with that kind of kindness and gentleness and so forth. Is that I think what I'd do is I'd connect to other people as well. Not just the people I agree with, but even the people I disagree with, and try to have a real and sincere conversation with people, And you can see this happen. People who are diametrically opposed to these issues, oftentimes when they get to talk and they meet the other person and they connect on that level of them being an image bearer of God, they can have a lot more empathy for them. They can say, and I would say too that civil disobedience is probably nothing you ought to do by yourself. You should, I don't think it's the kind of thing where like, oh, today I'm doing this. I don't care. Right? I think you need, and at that point, I would say you not only need other people to be involved in that so that you get the bigger picture, but you also help them to see some things that would be better about it, and it makes the possibility of change a greater possibility. 2 people versus 100 people. If they think about that, it just makes that a greater possibility. And it keeps you out of that selfishness, kind of thing. It's just about me.
Yeah, and I would say that first identify what's the story that's informing you. We have the fortune of being American citizens. Well, our story is about civil disobedience.
Right.
There's this thing called the Tea Party. I mean, the Tea Party. The
Tea Party.
Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. So, that has informed our understanding of civil. So it doesn't make sense for people to say, well, we shouldn't stand up against things that are unjust because our birth of our nation came out of standing up.
But again, you
against
think
that.
about that. It wasn't like just some individual here, another individual over here. People got together.
It's collective.
Colonial Congress, so to speak. Where representatives from different places came. They talked about it. They worked it out. They wanted to be specific about how to say it. They needed to say what they affirmed as being the truth that was being stepped on. What was good and what would it look like if this was opened up and so
which was the point behind King's letter from Birmingham jail, because he wrote to white clergy. Basically, he was saying like, hey, there's this larger collective. It's called Brothers and Sisters of Christ, and we're getting our heads kicked in here, but it doesn't seem like our white brothers and sisters are doing anything about it. So he wrote to the clergy saying, hey, can y'all like throw us a bone here? Like, we're supposedly brothers and sisters. How come this isn't working itself out? And they're like, well, we have a slower way of making things change here and so forth. And that was the impetus, though, for his letter from Birmingham jail, because he recognized this collective. Yeah. Hey, there's a larger unity that we can hold to as children of God, and that should inform this larger collective movement, as opposed to making this just, this is just about blacks in the South, So I think that's that. What's the story that's shaping our consciousness? And then, I think what Terry said is how is what I'm doing or thinking connected to a larger, and in the midst of that, is it benefiting me? Am I looking for the benefit, or am I actually realizing that, hey, this seems like an injustice to someone else, and maybe I need to know a little bit more about what they're experiencing.
And this is why it's so impressive when people commit themselves to a national project of some kind. Like, for instance, you're in the armed services. You're basically saying, I don't know that guy that I'm standing next to. He's from Delaware, and I'm from Pennsylvania, and that guy's from Nevada. But we're standing beside each other, giving our lives to protect that person and to move forward with what we think is correct and what's right. That's an incredible commitment to be able to. And the church supposedly should be doing the same thing. Yeah. We stand beside people that are not like us from different things, maybe a little difference here on theology of this and that, but we're willing to say this God has revealed this to be the thing that we want to move in that in that movement, in that direction for. So. Yeah, we're going to go. We're going to do it.
Unity instead of uniformity.
Yeah.
How do we find our collective unity, and what are the majors that we're going to major in, type of thing.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, maybe I'll finish by reading this excerpt from gotquestions.org. Hesitate to give God Questions a bone because it's kind of doing the exact same thing we're doing on this podcast. But it's a great resource for anyone out there that has questions. So some of the bullet points they give at the end, they say Christians should resist a government that commands or compels evil. I think those 2 words are really important, commands and compels, and should work nonviolently within the laws of the land to change a government that permits evil. Secondly, civil disobedience is permitted when the government's laws or commands are in direct violation of God's laws and commands. Thirdly, if a Christian disobeys an evil government, unless he can flee from the government, he should accept that government's punishment for his actions. And then finally, Christians are certainly permitted to work to install new government leaders within the laws that have been established. So, any other thoughts on this subject?
I would just say this, we're moving towards an election, and in a certain sense, voting is a type of civil obedience. Yeah. That's a way in which you demonstrate if you think you want to have change done in a way that seems to be just, and it seems to be one that avoids the violence that oftentimes had, then get out there and vote. Have your voice heard. And as we move towards that, I said, be more convinced by the arguments that tend to have basis in some kind of truth in the imago Dei of human beings, the question of justice and what that looks like, the idea of what a good society you'd want it to reflect. What do you think would be not only beneficial for you, but would be a way in which you could love your neighbor, the country, and the people together could love their neighbor. And that's so important that it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, that your vote becomes your voice of participation.
Yeah.
And if you're not satisfied with the ones you have, you always have a few write-in votes yourself. Terry Thomas for president.
Yeah, I got a couple of those.
Yeah. Well, nice. Well, thanks so much for helping us out today, guys. We really appreciate your input on this subject.
Sure.
It can be a very difficult one, but I think you guys laid it out in a way that was very helpful to people listening. So. Yeah.